The frontier gives no second chances, only a single brutal opportunity to show what a soul is truly made of when all else is gone. The last train departed Serpent's Bend as twilight bled across the jagged peaks, its fading whistle a lonesome cry against the vast, empty canvas of the territory. The station was a forgotten place, a splintered dock in an ocean of dust and rock, where the wind whispered tales of isolation. A profound silence settled over the land, the kind that made a man's own heartbeat sound like a drum of warning. It was a place where hope came to die, and tonight it had delivered a fresh victim, stranded under the immense, indifferent sky. The air grew cold, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the chill of the coming night. She stood alone, a specter in a wedding dress, the fine lace caked with the grime of her journey. Her veil, torn and ragged, fluttered in the breeze like a ghost's lament. She did not weep. The tears had frozen somewhere deep inside, replaced by a cold, trembling fear. Earlier, two men with eyes like chips of slate had escorted her onto the train. They had spoken to no one, their faces grim masks. When the locomotive hissed to a halt at this desolate outpost, they pushed her onto the platform without a word, their movements efficient and cruel, as if disposing of unwanted baggage. The worn leather suitcase landed in the dust beside her with a dull thud. Before she could react, the men had reboarded, melting back into the shadows of the carriage. The great iron wheels began to turn, groaning as they gathered speed, pulling her last connection to the known world away into the encroaching darkness. The townsfolk of her home had watched her leave, their faces a mixture of pity and fear, too intimidated by her escorts to offer a word of comfort. They knew the man she was to marry. They knew his reputation, and they knew this journey was not one of choice. Now there was nothing. Only the darkening plains, the distant silhouette of the mountains, and the oppressive silence. She clutched her hands together, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the empty tracks that stretched into infinity. She did not scream for help, for she knew none would come. They had left her here to be erased by the wilderness, a forgotten bride in a forgotten land. She was a secret to be buried by the wind and the dust, and for the first time, a flicker of defiance sparked within her terror. She would not be buried so easily. Ethan Garrett rode into Serpent's Bend seeking nothing more than a bottle of cheap whiskey and the oblivion it promised. His face was a map of hard miles and harder memories, the lines around his eyes carved by too many suns and one particular shadow he could never outrun. He was once a tracker of renown, but the ghosts of a homesteader family he had failed to save from raiders years ago clung to him like a shroud. Now he drifted from one dusty town to the next, a man haunted by the past, his skill with a firearm a curse rather than a gift. The town was as empty as his soul. He saw her then, sitting on a broken bench by the deserted depot. A woman in a sullied white dress, a stark figure against the gloom. Her posture was rigid with fear, but as he drew closer, he saw something else in the set of her jaw, a sliver of unbroken will. He moved quietly, not wanting to startle her, his boots scuffing softly in the dirt. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, as if she could will the train to return through sheer force. He knew that look. It was the look of someone who had lost everything in the span of a single sunset. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rasp from disuse. She flinched violently, a small cry escaping her lips. The suitcase tumbled from her lap, its latch giving way. Its contents spilled into the dust, lace gloves, an ivory comb, and a thick, leather-bound book. Ethan knelt, his movements slow and deliberate, helping her gather the items. The book was not a Bible. It was a ledger, its pages filled with neat columns of figures and names. His fingers brushed a dark bruise on her wrist, carefully concealed by her sleeve. Her breath hitched. The story was there, written in her fear. "He left me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Barrett Caldwell. He left me here to die." She told him she had discovered the truth of his dealings in that very book. Ethan looked from the ledger to her frightened eyes, and the ghost of the family he could not save stirred within him. This was a chance. Not for glory, but for something quieter. Redemption. "My name is Ethan Garrett," he said, his voice steady. "There is a town called Providence. They say the law there is straight. I can take you, if you will trust me." The journey to Providence was a crucible of wind and sun. The trail cut through a harsh, unforgiving landscape of rock and thorn. Elara Finch, as she had introduced herself, rode without complaint, her resilience a quiet testament to her inner strength. As they rode, she spoke of her past. Her father, once a partner of Barrett Caldwell, had died in a suspicious cattle stampede. Now Caldwell, a man who owned more land than God had ever intended for one person, sought to claim her inheritance and, more importantly, silence what she knew. The ledger in her satchel was the key to it all. Providence appeared in the distance like a promise, a cluster of wooden buildings huddled in a shallow valley. But as they rode down the main street, a sense of unease settled over Ethan. The town was too quiet, the glances from the few people they saw too furtive. They made their way to the sheriff's office. A man with a tin star and shifty eyes leaned back in his chair. "Sheriff is out," he said, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Name's Cobb. Deputy." His gaze lingered on Elara, a flicker of recognition in their depths. Ethan's hand drifted near his revolver. Cobb tried to hold them, citing a vague report of horse thieves in the area. "Just need to ask you a few questions," he drawled, his tone oily. "Might take a while." Ethan saw the trap closing. This man was on Caldwell's payroll. He politely declined, stating they were just passing through and would not be delayed. Cobb's eyes hardened. "That would be a mistake," he warned, his voice low. The threat was clear. They were not welcome here. They were prey. Providence was not a sanctuary, it was another cage. That night, they took a room at the boarding house, but sleep was a luxury neither could afford. From the window, Ethan watched as shadows moved in the street below. Men gathering in alleyways, their faces obscured by the brims of their hats. Caldwell's influence was a web, and they were caught in it. "We leave now," Ethan whispered. Under the cover of a moonless sky, they slipped out the back, leading their horses through the silent back streets. Behind them, they heard the sound of a door being kicked in. They had escaped, but now they were fugitives with nowhere left to run. They rode into the Badlands, a desolate expanse where the law was what a man could enforce with a firearm. The terrain was brutal, a maze of canyons and arid mesas that tested their horses and their resolve. Ethan knew these lands. He also knew they could not survive out here for long without help. He had a destination in mind, a place of last resort. "There is a man," he told Elara, his voice tight. "An old friend. A trapper. Gus McCoy. He lives deep in the canyons. If anyone can hide us, it is him." The hope was a fragile thing, easily broken. After 2 days of hard riding, they found the cabin. It was tucked away in a narrow canyon, almost invisible against the rock face. A thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney. An old man with a weathered face and a patch over one eye emerged, a long rifle held loosely in his arms. His single eye, sharp and piercing, took in the sight of them, a weary gunman and a woman in the tattered remains of a wedding dress. He did not smile. Gus McCoy was not a man given to pleasantries. He was a man made of the same hard rock as the canyon he called home. "Ethan Garrett," Gus grunted, his voice like grinding stones. "Thought the buzzards had picked you clean years ago." Ethan dismounted. He told their story concisely, leaving out no detail, from the ledger to the escape from Providence. Gus listened, his gaze shifting from Ethan to Elara. He looked at the exhaustion and fear in her eyes, and the resolve that lay beneath. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Caldwell," he spat the name like a curse. "He is a poison in this territory. You did right to run. Get your horses tended. You can stay." The cabin was small and smelled of pine smoke and cured hides, but it was the safest place they had been in days. Gus shared his meager meal of jerky and beans, and as the canyon wind howled outside, a fragile peace settled over them. Ilara finally allowed herself to breathe, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time since she had been thrown from the train. She watched Ethan and Gus speak in low tones, two men bound by a past she did not know. For now, they were sheltered. For now, the hunt was stalled. But they all knew it was only a matter of time. In the sanctuary of the canyon, a change began in Ilara. The fear that had been her constant companion started to recede, replaced by a cold, hard purpose. Under Gus's tutelage, she learned the ways of survival. He taught her how to handle a revolver, her hands shaking at first, then steadying with practice. He showed her how to set a snare, how to read the tracks of animals, how to build a fire that gave off heat but little smoke. She absorbed every lesson with a fierce intensity, her spirit hardening like forged steel. She was no longer a bride in distress. She was becoming a survivor. Ethan watched her transformation with a quiet awe. He saw the way she held her chin high, the way her eyes, once wide with fright, now scanned the horizon with a practiced alertness. A respect he had rarely felt for anyone grew within him, and with it, something more tender and far more dangerous. He found himself listening for the sound of her voice, found his gaze drawn to the determined set of her jaw. This feeling was an unwelcome guest in the barren landscape of his heart, a complication he did not need, but one he could not deny. The evenings were their time of quiet connection. Around the crackling campfire they would talk, their stories weaving a bond between them. She spoke of her father, of her life before Caldwell had destroyed it. He spoke little of his own past, but she saw the sorrow in his eyes and did not press. One evening she tended a cut on his hand, her touch gentle but sure. Their eyes met over the small act of care, and in that silent moment, a profound understanding passed between them. It was a closeness born not of words but of shared hardship. "Your peace here is bought on borrowed time," Gus warned them one night, his good eye narrowed as he stared into the fire. "Caldwell has a man, a tracker named Lefty Rourke. They say he can track a ghost across slick rock in a rainstorm. He is patient, more animal than man. When Caldwell gets tired of waiting, he will send Rourke, and he will find you." The old trapper's words hung in the cold night air, a chilling premonition. The fragile peace of the canyon was about to be shattered. The hunt was not over. It was about to become far more deadly. The warning became reality at dawn. A single rifle shot echoed through the canyon, splintering the morning calm. A bullet tore through the wooden wall of the cabin, inches from where Ilara slept. They were found. Ethan grabbed his Winchester, his mind racing. "Rourke!" Gus snarled, already moving toward the door. Through the window, they could see dark figures moving among the rocks, circling the cabin like wolves. The siege had begun. There was no escape. There was only the fight. The sanctuary had become their trap. Gunfire erupted from all sides, a storm of lead that pinned them down. Glass shattered, and wood splintered around them. Ethan and Gus returned fire, their shots measured and precise, making every bullet count. Ilara, her fear replaced by a cold focus, reloaded the rifles, her movements swift and efficient. She was no longer a student. She was a soldier in a desperate war. They fought from window to window, the small cabin, their only fortress against the unseen enemy that surrounded them, their determination, a silent promise to fight to the last. As the sun climbed higher, Gus knew they were doomed if they stayed. "You two have to run," he yelled over the din. "The ledger must get through." Before Ethan could argue, the old trapper kicked open the door and laid down a barrage of covering fire, drawing the attackers' attention. It was a deliberate sacrifice. A bullet struck him, and he fell, but his act of bravery had created the opening they needed. Ethan grabbed Ilara's arm, pulling her toward the back window. "Go! Now!" he commanded, his heart breaking as he left his friend behind. They scrambled out into the rocks, the sounds of the gunfight fading behind them. They did not stop running until they collapsed, gasping for breath, miles away. The cost of their escape was a heavy one. When they finally crept back under the cover of dusk, they found the battle over. Rourke and his men were gone. Gus lay where he had fallen, his life given for theirs. In his cold hand, he still clutched his rifle. With heavy hearts, they buried him beneath a lone pine tree. Their flight had ended. Now, fueled by grief and rage, their mission for justice began. Grief was a heavy cloak on the long ride to redemption. Every mile was haunted by the memory of Gus's sacrifice. The ledger, now tucked securely in Ethan's saddlebag, felt heavier than ever, a final testament to the old trapper's faith in them. They were no longer running for their own lives. They were carrying the hope of a dead friend and the weight of all of Caldwell's victims. The landscape was harsh and indifferent, but their purpose was now as hard and unyielding as the rock beneath their horses' hooves. They would not fail. The shared loss forged a new, unbreakable link between them. They moved as one, anticipating each other's needs without a word. He would take the first watch at night, his Winchester across his lap, his gaze sweeping the darkness. She would have coffee ready for him at dawn, her presence a quiet source of strength. They were partners in a way that went beyond survival. They were two halves of a single, determined whole, their individual resolve magnified by the other's presence. In the crucible of their journey, they had become a formidable team. One night, as they sat by the fire beneath a blanket of stars, Ethan looked at Elara. The firelight danced in her eyes, illuminating the strength that had been there all along. He knew what he had to do. It was not a decision born of passion, but of a deeper, more profound truth. "Elara," he began, his voice low and steady, "I have nothing to offer you. No home, no peaceful future, only a name and the protection of my firearm. But I am asking you to marry me." He held her gaze, his heart laid bare. She did not look away. She saw past the weary gunman to the honorable man beneath. She understood his offer was not about romance, but about a vow, a pledge to stand by her side, to make her fight his own, to give her the legal standing of a wife, not a piece of property to be claimed by a monster like Caldwell. In his tired eyes, she saw unwavering loyalty. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, Ethan, I will." Their hands met across the fire, sealing a promise more binding than any written law. The town of Redemption lived up to its name, but it greeted them with the wary silence of a place that had learned not to trust strangers. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with false-fronted buildings that seemed to hold their breath. They went directly to the office of Judge Gideon Blackwood. The judge was a man carved from granite, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. He listened to their entire story without interruption, his steepled fingers resting on his desk, his expression unreadable. When they finished, Ethan placed the ledger on the desk. The judge opened it, his sharp eyes scanning the neat columns of damning evidence. A low whistle escaped his lips. "This," he said, his voice a deep baritone, "is enough to see Caldwell and his whole rotten enterprise dismantled. But he will not come quietly. Bringing this here was not the end of your fight, son. It was the beginning of the war." He closed the book, his jaw set. "But it is a war this town has needed to fight for a long time." The judge was not their only ally. He directed them to The Last Chance, a saloon run by a woman named Martha. She was a stern-faced widow with eyes that held no fear. When she heard their story and saw Elara's resolute face, she nodded curtly. "Caldwell's greed cost me my husband and my ranch," she said, her voice laced with cold fury. "You will be safe here. The judge is the law, but this town has a memory, and we do not forget our debts." She placed a loaded shotgun on the bar between them, a clear statement of her allegiance. Martha's saloon became their sanctuary and their war room. Through her, they learned that the town was simmering with resentment. Many had been ruined or threatened by Caldwell, but they were too afraid to stand against him alone. The arrival of Ethan and Elara, armed with the proof of his crimes, was the spark they had been waiting for. Word spread through Redemption like a brush fire. A choice was coming. People would have to decide whether to cower under Caldwell's shadow or stand with the law and the light. Barrett Caldwell rode into redemption at the head of 20 men, a black storm of arrogance and menace. He did not come to negotiate. He stopped in the center of the main street, his voice booming with authority. "I am here for my property and the thief who stole her," he declared, his gaze sweeping the town. "There is a generous reward for anyone who delivers them to me, and a grave for anyone who stands in my way." He expected fear to do his work for him. He did not expect the steely silence that answered him. When his men charged the courthouse, they were met with a storm of gunfire. Ethan and the judge's deputies fired from the windows, their shots finding their marks. But the true surprise came from across the street. The windows of the Last Chance Saloon exploded in a volley of lead as Martha and a handful of determined townsfolk joined the fray. The street became a chaotic battlefield. Caldwell's hired guns caught in a deadly crossfire. The town of Redemption was fighting back. From a second-story window in the courthouse, Ilara was a figure of calm focus. The revolver Gus had taught her to use felt like an extension of her own will. She fired with a steady hand, her shots aimed not to kill, but to disable, to disarm, to disrupt the attack. She saw one of Caldwell's men taking aim at Ethan and fired without hesitation, the bullet knocking the man's rifle from his hands. She was no longer a victim to be rescued. She was a defender, protecting the man who had protected her and the town that had become her home. The battle raged, but Caldwell's forces were faltering against the town's unified defiance. Finally, in a fit of rage, Caldwell himself strode into the open, his revolver drawn, searching for a target. Ethan met him in the center of the street. Time seemed to slow. The gunshots faded to a dull roar. It was just the two of them. 2 shots rang out, almost as one. When the smoke cleared, Barrett Caldwell lay still in the dust. Ethan stood over him, a dark stain spreading on his side, but he was standing. The war was over. Victory came at a cost, but it was absolute. With Caldwell dead and the ledger in the hands of Judge Blackwood, his criminal empire crumbled. His men surrendered or fled, and one by one people came forward, their fear broken, to add their own testimony to the record. The law, swift and unyielding, swept through the territory, cleansing the land of Caldwell's corruption. The judge, true to his word, saw that the old warrants for Ethan's arrest were formally nullified in light of his actions. He was a free man. Ilara's inheritance, the land and assets her father had left her, was legally restored. They were no longer fugitives. They had money, freedom, and a future they could write for themselves. They could have left Redemption, could have started a new life anywhere. But as they looked at the faces of the people who had fought alongside them, at the town that had risked everything for the sake of justice, they knew they were already home. This was where they belonged. This was the place they had earned. They purchased a small ranch on a hill overlooking the valley, its fences in need of mending and its roof in need of patching. It was a place to rebuild, a place to heal. The people of Redemption came to help, offering their labor and friendship freely. Neighbors brought lumber, Martha brought food, and the judge brought a bottle of fine whiskey to celebrate. As they worked, turning the neglected land into a home, they were not just building a ranch, they were building a life together. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, Ethan and Ilara stood on their porch. The air was peaceful, filled with the scent of pine and the promise of rain. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "It is quiet," she said softly. He wrapped his arm around her, his touch warm and steady. "It is," he agreed. The long, bloody trail was behind them. Before them lay only the land, the sky, and each other. The West was a hard country, but it was also a place of second chances. And they had found theirs.